1999 really, there's been a decade of uneasy civilian rule between Benazir Bhutto's Pakistan People's Party and Nawaz Sharif's Pakistan Muslim League. General Musharraf stages a coup and claims that this is going to be a period of enlightened moderation. And in this, he definitely used women's empowerment as a tool to promote this liberal facade, which actually at the backdrop had a war on terror raging that he offered to fight for the United States. Dual-faced policy was such that it emboldened right-wing forces, peasant women of Okada, who joined the male protesters against unfair tenancy contracts with the military administration in several farms in Punjab, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the front and along the border with Afghanistan, incarcerated, were jailed, were sent off to Guantanamo Bay and handed over to the United States. And the women of these right-wing parties were not just empowering themselves, but they were devastating women's progress, especially in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where they formed government under the MMA, the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal. A lot of diaspora Pakistanis started, I would say, competing for relevance by criticizing women's groups in the country. And this was not the first time. Dr Zia has also talked about how it happened in the 80s and 90s. Now, this era of Pakistani feminism, I call it it's been a period of lifestyle liberalism and of what is known as governance feminism. So the earlier themes of co-optation, of collaboration with the state was once again a challenge for Pakistani feminists. So we have, by this time in 2000, or in 1999 really, there's been a decade of uneasy civilian rule between Benazir Bhutto's Pakistan People's Party and Nawaz Sharif's Pakistan Muslim League. And in 1999, in contrast to General Zia, General Musharraf stages a coup and claims that this is going to be a period of enlightened moderation. And in this, he definitely used women's empowerment as a tool to promote this liberal facade, which actually at the backdrop had a war on terror raging that he offered to fight for the United States. And in 2002, so we see a mixed bag of things happening over here, and it's a period of paradoxes. In 2002, he introduced an unprecedented high number of quotas for women to be represented in all tiers of government and put women into high offices. Now, no prior civilian government had done that. Of course, it's easier when you're a dictator and you violate the constitution and you bypass and short circuit legal methods. But the point is that this has been an important legacy because women's representation increased and made a big difference in Pakistan's legislature and in terms of their performances as representatives. But it came at the cost of democratic principles, and at the same time, the dual-faced policy was such that it emboldened right-wing forces and it showcased or instrumentalized women's rights for authoritarian ends. So there's a big difference when you use women's rights and promote and underwrite women's rights for feminist goals or feminist ends or people's ends, or when you do it simply to strengthen authoritarian goals. So this is a period, like I said, which is fraught with contradictions and ideological paradoxes. And there was, again, a lot of debate and a lot of differences between feminists and between women's groups, many of whom refused to engage with the Musharraf regime, and others who found it was strategically important to do so and did participate. And one of the paradoxes that we see over here is, for example, the peasant women of Okada who joined the male protesters against unfair tenancy contracts with the military administration in several farms in Punjab. They were certainly not beneficiaries of state patronage. They were arrested, they were denied their rights, and at the same time, many people in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the front and along the border with Afghanistan were incarcerated, were jailed, were sent off to Guantanamo Bay and handed over to the United States. So there was a lot of violations of human rights taking place under this disguise or cover of enlightenment and liberal. And so that's why a lot of social scientists call it liberal lifestyle, not true liberalism. And in several op-ed pieces that I wrote at this time, and also in an essay called The Reinvention of Feminism in Pakistan, I documented these paradoxes that saw the rise of women NGO leadership and its influences because of Musharraf's policies. But I call this a form of governance feminism with strong donor support and a lot of linkages to the United Nations, etc. So, and his dual policies were empowering the unelectable religious parties. Suddenly, they also became empowered. And the women of these right-wing parties were not just empowering themselves, but they were devastating women's progress, especially in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where they formed government under the MMA, the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal, which was an alliance of many religious parties. And they colluded to institute a lot of anti-women policies throughout the provincial and national assemblies. And this is on record. And there tends to be very little feminist thesis on how these right-wing women empowered themselves, but at the cost of women's rights, progressive women's rights, liberal women's rights. And there are lots of theses instead on right-wing women's agency and al-Huda and pietist movements that arose at this time. Piety used to be male-dominated. Certainly, this was a period when women came into this field as well. As I said, there was a lot of divisions and debates within the women's movement on this issue. And because of globalization, a lot of diaspora Pakistanis started I would say competing for relevance by criticizing women's groups in the country. And this was not the first time. Shaila Zia has also talked about how it happened in the 80s and 90s, that overseas Pakistanis and feminists and women overseas would be critical. And she was impatient with this as well, because what we saw was in the new millennium was feminism became more about individual feminists rather than about joining collectives and being part of collectives. And they were forming their own identity that was different, which steered away from older feminists, and the kind of position and jostling and debates about authenticity on who can authentically speak for gender rights and roles. And there was also an impatience or a reluctance to promote what they call binaries between religious agency and subjectivity and the effort to decolonize feminism, but also away from secular liberal ideals that they felt that was being upholded by many of the older organizations. But this was a fairly rudderless and sort of politically confused activism, and several people have talked about how it was also highly performative because it depended heavily on social media, not collectives, not political expression. It was a very post-secular political moment, let's put it this way, and proliferated by a lot of literature, not on feminist resistance, but on piety movements. And there was a lot of gender studies and PhD studies, which was quite infatuated with these right-wing movements. And so, of course, there was clash. And of course, there was opposition on the issue of gender with religious parties and feminist groups at this time. But in 2000, simultaneously, we have Women's Action Forum opened up a new chapter in Hyderabad, for example, which mobilized a lot of women to participate in mass campaigns in rural areas as well. So we see that expansion going on. There were they take up a lot of cases of violence against women and honor crimes that take place in Sindh, for example. They travel everywhere across Sindh. And in 2003, the National Commission on the Status of Women, which was constituted as a statutory body, again, this was under General Musharraf's time period, they recommended the repeal of the Zina Ordinance. And this was an important step, a structural step. And there's very few countries in the world where Islamic law has been diluted. And I think it's important to note that. So when this law was amended in 2006 under the Women's Protection Act, this also has been challenged as being contradictory to Islamic injunctions by the Federal Shariat Court, and the appeal is pending. In 2004, a weak honor crime law was passed. Later, it was strengthened in 2015 and 16 with an amendment. And in 2005, the gang rape survivor Mukhtar case made international headlines when General Musharraf dismissed it as a ploy that women used to gain asylum to get to Canada. So this was revealing now the contradictions and revealing the kind of sexism and patriarchal attitudes that even liberal men pretend to hold. The Council of Islamic Ideology became very vocal and empowered at this time. And it's important to note that when the chairperson of the Council of Islamic Ideology is an Islamic scholar, which it was under Musharraf, there were quite a few progressive policies and negotiations that were possible for women's rights. But when you have clerics sitting in the chairs, these tend to collapse into very medieval recommendations and sort of regressive ones. So in this time period, the search for nuance and non-binary possibilities, a lot of feminists were criticized for being liberal sellouts, and my own work does critique the collaboration, not quite so harshly, but in an informed way, because these debates did take place and we did challenge each other. But the post-secularists tended to be sort of harsher critics of it. But at the same time, the Jamaat-e-Islami and even the Tehreek-e-Taliban in some cases were romanced as vanguards and as authentic working-class revolutionary by others. And this is sort of a summary of it, but certainly that sentiment, you can read it in a lot of literatures, particularly if you go back and read. We have over here, for example, the liberal paradoxes are just listed in terms of the kind of struggles and oppositions and differences that we perceive in this time period. Now, by 2007, the right wing, it's important to say, stayed very clear-eyed. These kind of debates were not happening between them, right? Certainly, there was some that was used by the state in terms of, whether suicide bombings are Islamic or not. I mean, jihad, what is the concept? A lot of that conversation was going on. But in terms of their agenda, they were quite clear-eyed. The women of Jamia Hafsa Madrasa in the capital Islamabad launched in 2007 vigilante campaigns preaching hardline Islam, and they even kidnapped a woman suspected of running a brothel. Later in 2014, they pledged allegiance to the IS as well. But so this is the rise of and the activism of what was considered to be benign, neutral women's right-wing or pietist movements, and they proved in 2007 very categorically that they were not so benign. But there was a lot of, again, like I said, post-secular scholarship that sympathized with the agency of these women who are seeking to cope with pressures of modernity and seeking to cope with things like Valentine's Day, etc. And I found this to be sort of a misanalysis, which was actually very popular and very heavily funded by Western academia and Western think tanks who wanted to understand the Muslim woman and wanted to understand Sharia identities and the alterity of women's subjectivities, but always right-wing subjectivities, not feminist subjectivities. And a lot of funds that went into madrasa reform. Should we have madrasa reform or shouldn't we? And this was a period of what I call donor-driven Islam. People object to, donor-driven liberal rights or progressive rights, but this was a period of donor-driven Islam, and Islamic studies became a lucrative career for Pakistani social scientists teaching in Western academia. For 20 years, that's mostly what we had. In 2007, Benazir Bhutto is assassinated shortly after her return from exile. But civilian rule restarts, and Musharraf is removed by the Charter of Democracy signed by the two leading parties. This is a period of when the lawyers' movement rose against General Musharraf, demanding the restoration of democracy and rule of law, and a lot of women's organizations and women activists participated, including a younger generation, fully in this fairly revolutionary movement. In 2008, the Pakistan People's Party wins the election and launches the Benazir Income Support Program as one of the largest cash handout programs in the world. And there's not just that, but a series of pro-women laws are passed. And I think that's something to be said about the legacy of the Musharrafian period, that now civilian parties become competitive. They realize the importance of women's rights, legal, symbolic, and otherwise. So a lot of the People's Party passes a lot of pro-women laws, including the Protection Against Sexual Harassment at the Workplace 2010, in which the works of many feminists has been important and contributed towards it, and also the Domestic Violence Act. Fawzia Saeed, Farzana Bari, a lot of women who put a lot of effort into this. We see over here also these women. In 2012, Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy won the Oscar Award for her documentary film on the practice of throwing acid to deface women. And these successes made them very controversial, these women. It created religio-nationalist anxieties and when, especially in the same year when the student and education advocate Malala Yousafzai survived an assassination attempt by the Taliban in Swat, she went on to win the Nobel Prize in 2014. She has been criticized as a controversial subject and as a neoliberal subject who is a pawn to the West's game of rescuing brown Muslim women, this trope. But some of the problems with these tropes, I think there's some validity to how the sort of Western patriarchy works and neoliberalism works in this way. But the problem is that the ones who offer these critiques are often the biggest beneficiaries of neoliberalism and globalization, and are in the West's tenure track and have security, and they enjoy liberal, secular, sexual freedoms in these secular states. So basically the point is not, a competition. It begs the question on how and where feminist critique should be pitched, and that it cannot always be external. And there is a need to be critically engaged with the state or with women's collectives to understand the kind of strategic moves that groups and feminists have to make when they are living through these moments. And eventually in 2014, over 140 students and faculty members of the Army Public School in Peshawar were mass murdered by the Taliban, and the mothers of APS martyrs continue today to fight for justice for these slain children. So even in this time period, you can see women's resistance, different kinds of forms that they take, and sometimes they get missed in the bigger picture, but there are lots of these micro movements that we need to pay attention to.